In continuation with our series on the lab, where we are studying the structure and function of the heart, one of the major um, concepts we're going to cover is coronary circulation. Coronary circulation is the blood flow to and from the heart. So, where does it all begin? It all begins, as you saw in the last class, the major vessel coming out of the heart, which is on the from the right and left ventricles. From the left ventricle comes the aorta. This is the aorta. The aorta has three parts: the ascending aorta, the arch of the aorta, and descending aorta. Now pay attention here. Right at the point of the beginning of the ascending aorta, you see two blood vessels coming out, one on the right, one on the left. The one on the right is called the coronary artery, the one on the left is called the left coronary artery. So there are two coronary arteries. And as you can see, this is the first branch of the aorta, the very first blood vessel that's carrying oxygenated blood to the heart. As they say, charity begins at home. So the heart, which pumps the blood, gets the first supply of the blood. Now, it is these coronary arteries that I earlier on referred to as being end arteries. They're an example of end arteries. So, what is an end artery? This, the cerebral arteries and the pulmonary arteries are called end arteries because they do not have collaterals. Collaterals means alternate flow of blood. This is the biggest problem we have with coronary, cerebral, and pulmonary arteries. So what is it? Is a collateral. So let's go back and see. The right coronary comes down and supplies the right ventricle. The left coronary supplies the left ventricle. So let's look at the distribution of it. So each coronary, as it comes out, gives rise to branches. Now let's go to the right coronary, since we are on the right side. The right coronary gives off branches that are known as marginal branches. See, it comes off here and gives off branches known as marginal branches, and it goes all the way behind to the back of the heart. As you can see here, this is the posterior view of the heart, and it goes to the back. This is your right coronary, this is your right ventricle, and gives the, after giving the marginal, it gives the posterior interventricular artery. This is the posterior interventricular artery. So, comes from the front, turns around, goes to the back, and gives rise to the posterior interventricular artery. So the right coronary has two branches. The anterior branch found on the surface of the right ventricle, known as marginal branches. It goes to the back, becomes the posterior interventricular artery. The left coronary, on the other hand, also gives off the branches. Watch this. It goes to the left side. It's called the circumflex. Circumflex because it has a kind of uh, circle-like uh, route. So it circles around on the left side, and then before it goes to the back of the heart in front, it gives rise to the anterior interventricular. So there are two critical, anterior and posterior. Posterior is from the right coronary, anterior is from the left coronary. Now, these two, especially the anterior interventricular, is of critical functional importance. Why? I'll tell you when we go to the EKG, because the wall that separates the ventricle, this wall that you see here, is called the interventricular septum. And it is in this interventricular septum the conducting system of the heart lies, and the blood flow from these verticular anterior interventricular arteries supply the septum, which in turn keeps the conducting system alive. So therefore, earlier on I said these coronaries are end arteries, meaning if the artery blocks at any point, if it blocks at this point, let's say it blocked at this point, At any point it blocks. The tendency is, let me pick a blue or green. So let's say it blocked at this point. Blood will only flow to this point and stop, and there's no flow beyond it. That's why it's called an end artery. It's a one-way street. So if there's a block to the anterior interventricular artery, it will knock off the conducting system and the person's heart will stop and the person goes into cardiac arrest simply by blocking the left coronary. And that's why if ever you pray for a heart block, pray for a right side, you won't die. If you get a left side, death is imminent because these are end arteries. There is no way to restore the blood flow. And that is why a person with this coronary thrombosis or embolism need to get that anticoagulant we talked about that can dissolve streptokinase within 90 minutes. And if not, the heart begins to die. So that's the importance of the coronary. So what do we have here? Right coronary gives rise to marginals and then traverses to the back of the heart to become the posterior interventricular. Left gives rise to anterior interventricular and goes to the back as the circumflex. So you can see this on the model. You can see this on these models as well as the diagrams. In your exam, you may get a diagram or a model, or you may get both. Usually you'll see a question like this, arrow, name the indicated blood vessel. So you have to know that you're looking at the heart from the back. Usually they'll give you anterior or posterior view. So if you're looking at the left coronary, this has to be the anterior view. So this is the left anterior interventricular artery. Okay, so that's about on the coronary arteries. Now, what is the venous drainage? The veins correspond to the heart. Typically, veins accompany arteries. So wherever you see an artery, you'll have a vein. But most often times when we do blood vessels, you'll see there are more veins than arteries. Why? Because blood flow is very slow. You need more channels to drain than supply. Because artery blood is flowing at high pressure and speed. So what's the drainage of the right side of the heart? The right side of the heart and the left side of the heart, there are two major veins. In the front is the great cardiac vein. The great cardiac vein corresponds to the front. Let's go to the front of the heart. So if you are looking at the front of the heart, is the image of the front. It lies next to the anterior interventricular artery. So the great cardiac vein lies in front. So this is your great cardiac vein. It drains to the vessel here known as the coronary sinus. The coronary sinus kind of runs around the base of the heart. Remember, this is called the base and this is the apex, runs at the base. And then from the back, you have the middle cardiac vein. So the posterior has a middle cardiac vein. So in this picture, you can see the artery and the veins lying next to each other. So if this is a posterior view, this is your middle cardiac vein. As you see, it goes up, and this is your coronary sinus. And this is your posterior interventricular artery. So in the exam, you'll find arrows like this. Name the indicated blood vessel, coronary sinus. Name the indicated blood vessel, middle cardiac vein. And if it is flipped to the front, this is called the great cardiac vein. How do you know this is the front? Because you can see this is the front view by the positioning of the heart. And lying next to it in this is your anterior interventricular coronary artery, anterior interventricular artery, which is a branch of the left coronary. So two major veins, great cardiac vein in front, middle cardiac vein drains into the coronary sinus, and the coronary sinus in turn drains into the right atrium. So remember the opening of the when you studied the right atrium chamber, there was a tiny opening known as the coronary sinus. That is the opening of the venous blood returning from the heart back to the heart. So this is these two major veins are the drainage of the heart. So you have the anterior great cardiac vein, posterior middle cardiac vein flowing into the coronary sinus, which empties into the right atrium. So that's the coronary circulation. So you've commonly heard of the term myocardial infarction. So what is an infarction? An infarction is the death of cardiac tissue following a blockage. And as you can see here, the blocks can occur in the interior of the coronary. And remember earlier on, I said that these coronary arteries are end arteries. End artery simply means that if the coronary blocks here, there is no branch from a neighbor to supply the heart in that region. So all the tissue under the supply of that artery will die. So here's an obstruction, as you can see here. And there are ways we treat this obstruction. The most common method, if it's not fully blocked, is to pass a catheter, and then at the end of the catheter is a balloon. We inflate the balloon, and the balloon will stretch the blood vessel, and then you remove it, and then it's unblocked. This is for partial blocks. But if it's a very severe block, then we have to go in and leave a stent. The stent is a spring-like structure that's left inside the coronary to keep the coronary open. And of course, if the block is so severe, we have to do what is called as CABG surgery. CABG stands for coronary artery bypass graft. As you can see here, we take a piece of vein from your leg, and we connect that vein to the aorta and then sew it to the part beyond the obstruction, as you can see on the left side. So this is why it's called a bypass. What are you bypassing? You're bypassing the obstruction. So if you do one bypass, we call it single. If you do two vessels, we call it a double bypass. How many bypasses can you do? Maximum 4. Quadruple bypass. That patient is really uh, quarter to go. That's the point of that person must have had serious blockages. So those are the aspects of the coronary artery. So now's the time for you to review that. Okay, we're going to go over the structures related to the conducting system of the heart. Now, these concepts are good for the lecture as well. We'll be covering that in the lecture as well. So what are the structures? Where are these found? And what is the order? So let's try and enlarge this picture or go to full screen. I'm not sure it allows me to do full screen. Are you able to see this?
Yes, Professor.
Okay. So let's look at the conducting system. The conducting system are electrically active components of the heart. Now, the first structure in the electrical conducting system is a group of cells in the wall between the right atrium and the left atrium. This wall is called as the interatrial septum. Inter, between, atria, septum, wall. Just like we have the interventricular septum here, between the two ventricles. A group of cardiac cells here are electrically active, roughly about 1% of these cells. And these cells spontaneously depolarize. Depolarization means they generate an electrical potential which results in an action potential. And these action potentials are now absorbed and they spread through the walls of the atria and are picked up by another group of cells. This group of cells in the right atrium is called the sinoatrial node. And this sinoatrial node is often referred to as the pacemaker. Now, question. So this is your pacemaker. This is what generates the electrical potential. Now, who put it in this location? Is this a permanent location? Its typical location is it's found in the right atrium, in the wall between the right and left atrium, just below the inferior vena cava, and it can vary in position. In some individual, for 98% of the world population, it will be in this location. For some others, it may be lower down, it may be at the bottom, and it could be at any of their locations, but it's always in the right atrium. So this action potential is picked up by another group of cells that is found at the junction between the atria and the ventricles. So this is called the atrioventricular node. So the atrioventricular node now picks up the action potential and it flows through a cable system. And this electrical cable in the first part is known as the bundle of His, or otherwise known as the atrioventricular bundle. And this atrioventricular is found in the interventricular septum. Remember, I told you this is the important muscle wall between the two ventricles. This electrical cable runs through, and as it's going down, it splits into two. It gives a right bundle and a left bundle. These are called the bundle branches. The right bundle supplies the right ventricle, the left bundle supplies the left ventricle. Now, critical element. These bundles will now terminate into the last group of conducting fibers known as the Purkinje fibers. So these are the 5 elements of the conducting system. For the lecture and lab exam, you will be asked, what is the correct order of the conducting elements or the elements of the conducting system of the heart? If you see the numbers here, you should be able to answer it. So number 1 is the SA node. The SA node transmits the impulse to the AV node. The AV node transmits it down to the bundle of His. Bundle of His goes to the bundle branches to the Purkinje fibers. So that's why it's numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So in the exam, you may get these in a jumbled form and ask what is the correct order of this. For lab exam, you may not get it. You may be asked, fill in the blanks. The action potential of the conducting system goes from the SA node to dash to dash to dash. Fill in the blanks. So you should be able to say from the SA node it goes to AV node to atrioventricular bundle, from there to the bundle branches, from there to the Purkinje fibers. So this is the conducting system. And what is the pathway? I've just described the pathway. So here's a question before we go into EKG. Why are, you can read this question, why are there specialized conducting fibers in the ventricle and not in the atria? Do you notice that there's no connection between the SA node and the AV node? The reason is, let's go back to the structure of the heart. And this is something that you should have studied in the last class when I asked you to look at the chambers of the heart. Now look at it. The atria are smaller than the ventricles. That's number 1. Number 2, look at the walls. The walls of the atria are very thin compared to the walls of the ventricle. Number 3, look at the wall of the left ventricle is twice as thick as the right. What does it tell you? When the walls are thick, it has more muscle. Why is the left ventricle having more muscle than the right? Function. Where is the blood being pumped from the right to the left side? Let's go back to the circulatory system. So if you look at this picture where the heart is pumping, you see blood from the right side is merely going up the pulmonary trunk to the lungs. It's a short distance, so it doesn't need so much force. But the left side, on the other hand, has to pump blood up the aorta around your body. So this is why, by design and not by chance, your left ventricles are larger, are thicker, and contain more muscles compared to the right ventricle. So, having understood that, the next question is, my question to you was, why is it there's no conducting system in the atria like these bundle branches and Purkinje, but there's only in the ventricles? The reason is twofold. Number 1, again, because the walls of the ventricle are thick, it needs a conducting system to convey the action potential. And this is the fastest way it can go through, because in the atria, it's a slow absorptive process. It goes from one cell to the other, and you can afford to do that because the ventricles are small. I mean, the atria are small and they are thin-walled. There is a second reason. The second reason is what we will study as part of the sequence of events in an EKG. So what is the sequence? The sequence of an EKG and the electrical activity of the heart. So Again, we'll repeat this in the lecture, but for now, just know that the action potential is generated by the SA node, picked up by the AV node, flows down the bundle of phase to the branches to the Purkinje. Being that this is an electrical activity, we can record this by using an equipment and a machine called an electrocardiogram. Electrocardiogram, or EKG. So an EKG is, let me go back to the shutter screen. Hold on 1 second, please. So an EKG is an electrocardiogram. We have two abbreviations, ECG and EKG. Why do we have two? It depends on where you got the equipment from. ECG is the British spelling, English, C for cardiac. The EKG comes from the German spelling, where cardia is spelled with a K. That's the only difference. And depending on where your equipment came, we call it ECG. Well, both are internationally acceptable. So we're not going to the details of how you do EKG, that you can Google and study. We're going to put sensors. The sensors are put on the surface of your chest, and there is a machine that has a graph paper, and the graph records the following recordings. So what are the things you need to know to be able to identify these? So I will have, okay, when you're studying EKG, so we said EKG is a paper recording of the electrical activity of the heart. So for lecture and lab, you need to study the EKG under three headings. Number one, as you're going to see, you need to know the name of the wave. We're going to see a set of waves. The second thing you need to know is what activity does the wave represent, and what physical event occurs during each wave. So three things. So you have these three columns. You need to know the wave, the activity, and the event. When we use the word activity, we are recording it as an electrical activity, and there are only two things. An action potential that is fired and that's traveling through the muscles is known as depolarization. So it's depolarization. And typically, the activity of depolarization is followed by repolarization. Now, the heart during depolarization will contract and will relax during repolarization. So always remember R for R. Repolarization means relax. Depolarization means contract. So let's go back to our EKG and ask ourselves. A typical EKG shows three sets of waves. The first wave, as you can see here, is called the P wave. The second is a set of three activities that is referred to as the QRS complex, because it has three waves. It has a Q wave, it has an R wave, it has an S, it occurs together, so we call it the QRS. And then finally you have the T wave. So this is number one, this is number two, and this is number three. So this is typically what we see. And when we come to the lecture of the heart, we will again be going over the activities and sequence of events. But just for now, this is how the waves represent what is happening in the heart. So let's go back to the former slide. Erase, clear. Okay. So I want you to follow this sequence of events. SA node fires or depolarizes, and the atria will contract. That contraction will be picked up and show on the EKG as the P wave. And then the AV node picks up and depolarizes the ventricles, and the ventricles will contract. And that contraction of the ventricle is known as systole. And after the contraction, the ventricles will relax. It's called as diastole. And in an EKG, we can see this activity. So what do you see? When the P wave is seen on an EKG, it indicates three things. So number one, it indicates, let's go back to our, so what's the name of the wave? It's called the P wave. Let's type it in. What is the electrical activity undergoing under the P wave? The P wave activity would be corresponding to the atria. So we say atrial is undergoing depolarization. Now, this is not allowing me to type in sequence, so you guys have to bear with me. So push this up. I don't know how this can go up. Why can't it stay up? Anyway, so atrial depolarization corresponds to the activity of atrial contraction. So what did we say atrial contraction is called? Systole. The second thing about the P wave is the P wave indicates the SA node has fired. So I go to my EKG. I've run this EKG. So when I ask you the question, what does the P wave denote? What does the P wave indicate? And your answer will be the P wave indicates, number one, the SA node has fired. And number two, the action potential is spreading in the atria and the atria is contracting. And because it's a positive electrical charge, you see the wave going up. If you see the wave going down, that's a negative charge. You can see here negative 0.5, positive 0.5, plus 1. That's the millivolts. So it's a small electrical activity. And then it goes into a period of quietness, and then you see the QRS kick off. Now, what is the first thing you notice about the QRS? It's a huge deflection. The QRS is a huge deflection, meaning it's a lot of activity. Why is there a lot of electrical activity? Go back to the walls. You see how thick the walls of the ventricles are? Therefore, it has more electrical activity, so it shows up with a large deflection. Then you notice it ends, it goes into a period of quietness, and then you get the T wave. The T wave is a smaller deflection of electrical activity. So the QRS is the period during which the ventricle is depolarizing, and it corresponds to the activity and the event. So let's go to the next label. So label this. So if you label, so when you see QRS, what does it tell you? The QRS denotes, what is this? This is not allowing me to type. Denotes ventricular depolarization. And this ventricular depolarization is now corresponding to the ventricle contracting. So what do we call that? Ventricular systole. And then followed by that is your P wave, which is ventricular repolarization. And repolarization is nothing but the relaxation of the ventricle, so we call it ventricular diastole. Diastole. So it's ventricular diastole. Okay. So let's go over this again. Three sets of waves. The QRS is part of, let's get this right in proper order. The third wave was called the T wave. So the P wave, presence of P wave tells me the SA node has fired, the pacemaker is working, it's sending out an electrical impulse, it's spreading in the atria is contracting, the activity is depolarization, and the physical event occurring is that the atria has contracted, and that is called as atrial systole. And then we go to the QRS. which is a huge wave, which tells me that the electrical activity has been picked up by the AV node, is spreading down the ventricles, is depolarizing, and it will lead to a ventricular contraction known as ventricular systole. And this is followed by a T wave, which shows that the ventricle is repolarizing. And that means the ventricle is now in a state of relaxation. So that's what these waves are denoting. Now, in the lecture, we'll be going into greater details, but for the lab, typically the question will be, name the wave, give what it indicates, name the activity, name the wave, name the event that corresponds to this wave. So don't give the wrong answer. If you give the wrong answer, you get no credit, even though your answer is correct, but you did not answer the question. So activity means you have to reply either it's depolarization or repolarization. If you say what event, you say it's either systole or diastole. And in the lecture, we'll go over some of the common EKG abnormalities. So once again, so the next concept is on heart sound. So what do you need to know about the heart sounds? Mainly, the heart sounds are created by the closure of the valves. And we know that we have two sets of valves, the atrioventricular valves and the semilunar valves. So these sounds traditionally are called as lub and dub. I really don't like lub and dub. All you have to remember is heart sounds lub. The way you should remember is it's the first heart sound. So if you asked, what is the first heart sound due to? There are two questions you'll be asked on this. What creates the first heart sound and when does it occur? The first heart sound is created by the closure of the atrioventricular valves. And that occurs. Can somebody tell me from our heart lecture, when do the AV valves close? During what activity of the heart? Which atrioventricular, the tricuspid and bicuspid valves will close during what? When the heart is doing what? When the ventricles are in what? When the ventricles are in contraction. So AV valves close during ventricular systole. So that's the exam question. What's the first heart sound? Closure of the AV valves. When does it occur? When the ventricles are contracting. What do we call that? We call that ventricular systole. This is followed by the second sound known as the dub. The dub is the second heart sound. Now this is as a result of the closure of the pulmonary semilunar valves, aortic and pulmonary semilunar valves. Where are these valves located? They are located at the opening of the aorta and the pulmonary trunk. Now, typically, this occurs during ventricular diastole. So ventricular diastole. So that means when the ventricle is relaxing, remember the dynamics, blood is trying to fall back. The blood was pushed up, and then when the ventricle relaxes, it's trying to come back, and the semilunar valves will click to close and prevent the backflow. So therefore, the second heart sound, dub, is heard during when the ventricle is relaxing, the semilunar valves close. So that's what you need to understand about the heart sounds. And now, when there is an abnormal sound in the heart, we call it as a murmur. A murmur is a soft rushing sound. And typically, based on the location of the murmur, when you're listening to heart sounds, you can actually say which valve is involved. So let's go in sequence. So the heart beats go as lub, dub, tsh, lub, dub, tsh. So if the murmur is coming after the dub sound, then we know that it's a defect of the semilunar valves. But if it comes in between lub and dub, like lub, tsh, dub, lub, tsh, dub, so it's coming between the lub and the dub, then I know that the problem lies in the AV valves. Now, what is the cause of these? We call them valvular defects. You can read more about it. It's a clinical condition. There are babies who are born with missing valves. There are babies who are born with faulty valves. There are genetic conditions where valves are defective, like such as in Down syndrome, a whole bunch of reasons. And there are some adults who develop defective valves due to disease of the valves, especially if somebody suffered from rheumatic heart disease or subacute bacterial endocarditis. One of the problems is the valves get damaged. So whatever the cause is, if a valve is damaged, blood will leak, and the leakage of blood across a faulty valve is referred to as a murmur. And this you can pick up with a stethoscope, but we these days do not use any stethoscope because we've replaced it with a Doppler, an ultrasound. So you go for a Doppler, an ultrasound, it will show which valve is defective, and then we got to fix it through surgery. So that's about the duration and concept of